The knife pressed against my throat, and I could feel my own heartbeat pulsing against the cold steel. The man holding me smelled of sweat and desperation, and something far more sinister that I would only understand years later. His breath was hot against my ear as he whispered words that no 12-year-old girl should ever hear. Words about what I was worth. Words about what would happen to me in the next few hours. Words that turned my blood to ice and made my legs buckle beneath me. I remember thinking, this is how I die. This is where my story ends. Not in a warm bed surrounded by people who love me. Not after a long life filled with memories and laughter and purpose. No, I was going to die in a filthy warehouse on the outskirts of a town whose name I did not even know. Sold by my own father. Abandoned by the world. Forgotten before I even had a chance to be remembered. But I did not die that night. And what happened next changed everything I believed about God and about miracles and about the power of a single desperate prayer whispered from the depths of a broken heart. If you stay with me through this story, you will discover something that took me years to understand. You will learn that God does not always prevent us from entering the valley of the shadow of death. Sometimes he walks us straight through it, but he never leaves us there. You will learn that the moments when you feel most abandoned are often the moments when heaven is paying the closest attention. And you will learn that your pain, whatever it may be, is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of your testimony. My name is Ada. I was born in a small village where the roads turned to mud every rainy season and where dreams went to die under the weight of poverty and tradition. For the first 5 years of my life, I knew happiness. I knew the warmth of my mother's arms. I knew the sound of her voice singing me to sleep. I knew the taste of the bread she baked on Sunday mornings. I knew love in its purest form. Then she was gone. Cancer, they said, though I was too young to understand what that word meant. All I knew was that my mother started coughing one spring, and by winter she was sleeping in a box in the ground. I remember standing at her grave holding my father's hand and wondering why he was crying. I remember asking him when Mama was coming back. I remember the way his face crumpled, and the way he pulled me close, and the way he smelled like the clear liquid he had started drinking from brown bottles. That was the last time my father held me with love. After my mother died, something inside him died too. The man who used to carry me on his shoulders and tell me stories about brave princesses and magical kingdoms disappeared. In his place stood a stranger, a man with hollow eyes and trembling hands, a man who spoke more to his bottles than to his own daughter, a man who gambled away everything we had in desperate attempts to win back what he had lost. Our house, which had once been filled with my mother's laughter and the smell of her cooking, became a tomb. The furniture disappeared piece by piece. Sold to pay debts I was too young to understand. The photographs of my mother vanished from the walls. The curtains she had sewn with her own hands were taken down and traded for a few coins. Soon the house was empty except for the ghosts of happier times and the ever-present smell of alcohol and despair. I tried to be good. I tried to be invisible. I learned to cook what little food we had. I learned to clean without being asked. I learned to disappear into the corners of rooms when my father came home stumbling and angry. I learned that love was something that could be taken away in an instant, and that the people who were supposed to protect you could become the very ones you needed protection from. School was my only escape. For 6 hours each day I could pretend I was normal. I could pretend I had a home filled with warmth and parents who asked about my homework and a future worth dreaming about. I loved learning. I loved the way words fit together on the page. I loved the magic of numbers and the stories hidden in history. My teachers said I was bright. They said I had potential. They said I could become something someday. I held onto those words like a drowning person holds onto a piece of driftwood. But even that was taken from me. I was 10 years old when my father pulled me out of school. He said we could not afford it. He said education was a luxury for rich people. He said I needed to work. And so I did. I cleaned houses for neighbors who looked at me with pity. I carried water from the well. I sold vegetables in the market. Every coin I earned went to my father, who drank it away before the sun set. I learned to survive on scraps. Leftover bread from the houses I cleaned. Bruised fruit that the market vendors threw away. I learned to make myself small. To take up as little space as possible. To need as little as possible. Because needing things meant disappointment, and disappointment meant pain, and I had already experienced enough pain to last several lifetimes. At night, I would lie on my thin mat on the floor and stare at the ceiling and talk to my mother. I told her about my day. I told her about the mean girls at the market who made fun of my worn clothes. I told her about the kind woman who sometimes gave me extra food. I told her that I missed her, that I needed her, that I did not understand why God had taken her away and left me alone with a father who no longer knew how to love. Sometimes in those dark, quiet moments, I would ask God if he was real. I would strain my ears listening for an answer, but all I heard was silence. Silence and the distant sound of my father's drunken snoring. I began to wonder if God had forgotten about me, or worse, if he had never known I existed at all. The years crawled by like wounded animals. My father's debts grew larger. The men who came to our door grew angrier. I heard whispered conversations, threats, numbers that meant nothing to me but everything to my father. He started looking at me differently, calculating, measuring, as if I were livestock at an auction. I did not understand then. I was too innocent to comprehend what he was planning, too trusting despite everything to believe that my own father could do what he was about to do. It began on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the days I went to the market to sell whatever vegetables I could find. I remember the sky was gray and heavy with the promise of rain. I remember feeling tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that seeps into your soul and makes you wonder if there is any point in continuing to put one foot in front of the other. When I returned home that evening, there was a man I had never seen before sitting in our kitchen. He was large with hands like slabs of meat and eyes that moved over me in a way that made my skin crawl. My father was sitting across from him. They were drinking together, laughing at jokes I could not hear. My father called me over. His voice was strange, too bright, too cheerful. He put his arm around my shoulders and turned me toward the stranger, and I felt like an object on display. The man looked at me with those crawling eyes and nodded slowly and said something to my father that I did not catch. That night after the man left, I found my father counting money at the kitchen table. More money than I had ever seen. Enough money to pay off his debts and buy enough alcohol to drown himself for months. I asked him where the money came from. He did not answer. I asked him who the man was. He told me to go to bed, but I saw the way his hands trembled. I saw the way he could not meet my eyes, and somewhere deep in my gut I knew that something terrible was coming. 3 days later, 2 men came to our house at dawn. They were not like the gambling debt collectors who shouted and threatened. These men were quiet, professional. They spoke in low voices and moved with practiced efficiency. One of them handed my father an envelope. The other one grabbed my arm. I screamed, I fought, I called for my father, but he just stood there counting the money in the envelope. He did not look up. He did not say goodbye. He did not cry. He had sold me, his own daughter, his own flesh and blood, the last living piece of my mother, sold to pay off his debts. I was 12 years old. The men put me in the back of a truck covered with a tarp that smelled of mold and gasoline. There were other children there, girls mostly, some my age, some younger. Their eyes were hollow and their spirits were broken, and they did not speak. They did not need to. We all knew where we were going even if we did not know the details. We drove for what felt like days. We stopped only for the men to eat and drink. They threw crusts of bread at us like we were animals. They laughed at our tears. They spoke about us as if we were not there, as if we were not human. I tried to pray. I tried to remember the prayers my mother had taught me, but the words would not come. My mind was a storm of terror and confusion and grief. I felt betrayed, abandoned, not just by my father but by God himself. What kind of God allowed this to happen? What kind of God watched a child be sold by her own father and did nothing? The truck finally stopped at a warehouse in a town I did not recognize. The men pulled us out one by one and lined us up against a wall. Another man walked down the line inspecting us like cattle at a market. He squeezed our arms to check our muscles. He looked at our teeth. He made notes in a small book. When he got to me, he stopped. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he nodded at one of the men who had brought us. That night, I was separated from the other children and taken to a small room at the back of the warehouse. It had a mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner and a single window too high to reach. The door locked from the outside. I was alone, completely, utterly, terrifyingly alone. I do not know how long I stayed in that room. Time lost all meaning. There was no day or night, just the flickering of a single bulb above my head and the sounds of men's voices from somewhere beyond the walls. They brought me food sometimes, rice and water, barely enough to survive. I thought about my mother constantly. I wondered if she was watching from heaven. I wondered if she was ashamed of what her daughter had become. I wondered if she was crying. I thought about escape. I studied the walls. I tested the door. I measured the height of the window. But I was weak from hunger and fear, and I knew that even if I got out, I had nowhere to go. No one was looking for me. No one cared if I lived or died. On the third night in that room, something broke inside me. Not my spirit. Not my will to survive. Something else. Something I cannot name. It was as if all the walls I had built around my heart crumbled at once, and everything I had been holding back came flooding out. I fell to my knees on that thin, dirty mattress, and I wept. I wept for my mother. I wept for my father who had once loved me. I wept for the childhood I never got to have. I wept for the future that had been stolen from me before it even began. And then somewhere in the depths of my despair, I found myself praying. Not the formal prayers my mother had taught me. Not the recited words I had heard in church on the rare occasions my father had taken me. These were different words. Raw words. Desperate words. Words torn from the deepest parts of my soul. God, I whispered through my tears, if you are real, if you can hear me, please save me. I have no one else. I have nothing else. I am alone and I am scared and I do not want to die in this place. Please, God, please, if you exist, show me, save me. I am begging you. I repeated those words over and over until my voice gave out, until my tears ran dry, until I collapsed on that mattress from sheer exhaustion. And then something happened. Something I still cannot fully explain, no matter how many times I try. As I lay there trembling in the darkness, I felt something. A warmth that started in my chest and spread outward until it filled my entire body. A sense of presence. As if someone had entered the room and was sitting beside me, holding me, comforting me. I heard no voice. I saw no vision. But I knew. Somehow in that moment I knew that I was not alone, that I had never been alone. That even in the depths of that hellish place there was someone watching over me, someone who saw my suffering, someone who was already working to set me free. For the first time in days, I slept peacefully. Before we go any further, if you believe in Jesus, subscribe to my channel, because we provide daily Jesus stories that change people's lives. Your subscription helps us reach more people with stories of hope and faith, and you become part of a community that believes in the power of God's love. Now let me tell you what happened next. I woke to the sound of shouting, men's voices raised in anger and confusion, the sound of running footsteps, the crash of doors being thrown open. I sat up on my mattress, my heart pounding. I did not know what was happening, but I felt it. That same warmth from the night before, that same sense of presence, as if invisible hands were reaching down from heaven to pull me out of the darkness. The door to my room burst open, and for a moment I was blinded by the light flooding in from the hallway. I raised my hands to shield my eyes, certain that this was the end, that the men had come to take me to whatever terrible fate awaited. But the figure in the doorway was not one of the men. It was a woman. She was older than my mother would have been if she had lived. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her face was lined with years of worry and laughter and love. But her eyes were what I noticed first. They were filled with tears and with something else. Recognition. She called my name. My real name. The name my mother had given me. The name I had not heard spoken with love in years. Ada, she said again. Oh, my child. My poor sweet child. I did not understand. I did not recognize her. I was too weak and too confused and too afraid to process what was happening. But she came to me. She knelt beside my mattress, and she gathered me in her arms, and she held me the way my mother used to hold me when I was small. And she wept. And I wept. And for a long moment neither of us could speak. Later I would learn her name was Grace. She was my mother's cousin. They had been close as children, but life and distance and circumstances had separated them. She had heard about my mother's death years after it happened. She had tried to find me. She had searched for years, following threads of information that led nowhere, hitting dead ends and closed doors. But she never gave up. She told me later that something woke her the night before. In the middle of the night, she sat up in her bed with my face in her mind and an overwhelming sense that something was wrong, that I was in danger, that she needed to find me immediately. She did not understand it. She had no logical explanation, but she could not ignore it. She called everyone she could think of, old family friends, distant relatives, anyone who might know anything about what had happened to me. One of those calls led to another, which led to another, which eventually led to a woman in my village who knew about my father's debts and about the men who had come for me. Grace called the authorities. She drove through the night. She somehow found the warehouse where I was being held. She led the police to the door. All of this in less than 24 hours. Less than 24 hours after I prayed that desperate prayer in the darkness. The men who had taken me were arrested. Some of the other children were returned to their families. Others who had no families to return to were placed in shelters and foster homes. The trafficking ring was broken, and I went home with Grace. I remember the car ride to her house. I sat in the back seat wrapped in a blanket she had brought for me, unable to speak, unable to process what had happened. Part of me was still waiting to wake up, still waiting for this to be revealed as a dream, still waiting for the nightmare to resume. But the warmth I had felt in that room stayed with me, that sense of presence, that knowing. God had heard me. God had answered. Not in the way I had expected, not through a lightning bolt from heaven or an army of angels, but through a woman named Grace who could not sleep, through a series of phone calls that should not have connected, through a chain of events so improbable that there was no explanation except the hand of God. Grace's house was small but clean and filled with light. She lived alone. Her husband had passed away years before, and her children had grown and moved to the city. But her home was not empty. It was full of books and photographs and the lingering scent of lavender. She gave me my own room, a real room with a real bed and real pillows and a window that looked out over a small garden. She bought me new clothes. She cooked me food, real food, warm food, food made with love. Those first few weeks were the hardest. My body began to recover, but my mind and my heart were still trapped in that warehouse. I had nightmares every night. I woke up screaming, convinced that the men had found me, that it had all been a trick, that I was still a prisoner. Grace never lost patience with me. She sat with me through the nightmares. She held me while I cried. She prayed with me and for me. She told me about Jesus, about his love for the broken and the lost and the forgotten, about how he too had been betrayed and abandoned and left to die, about how death could not hold him and about how darkness could not overcome his light. I listened, at first with skepticism. How could I believe in a loving God when I had experienced so much pain? How could I trust in a Father in heaven when my own father had sold me like property? But Grace did not argue with my doubts. She did not preach at me or pressure me. She simply lived her faith in front of me. She showed me love through her actions. She demonstrated grace through her patience. She reflected God's light through the way she treated everyone around her. And slowly, very slowly, my heart began to open. One night, about 6 months after my rescue, I was lying in bed thinking about everything that had happened. Thinking about my mother and my father and the warehouse and Grace. Thinking about that moment when I had prayed in desperation and felt that overwhelming sense of presence. I realized something in that moment, something that would shape the rest of my life. God had not caused my suffering. He had not taken my mother or made my father into a monster or allowed those men to steal me. That was the work of a broken world and broken people making broken choices. But God had been there through all of it. He had been there in the love of teachers who saw my potential. He had been there in the kindness of strangers who gave me food. He had been there in the persistence of a distant relative who never stopped searching. And he had been there in that dark room, sitting beside me, holding me, preparing my rescue before I even knew I needed it. I did not become religious overnight. Faith is not a switch that you flip. It is a journey, a process, a daily decision to trust even when you cannot see the path ahead. But I began to pray, not out of desperation anymore, out of relationship. I talked to God like I used to talk to my mother. I told him about my day. I told him about my fears. I asked him questions I knew I might never get answers to. And slowly over time I began to hear him, not in an audible voice, but in the peace that settled over me when I prayed, in the wisdom that seemed to come from nowhere when I needed it most, in the gentle nudges that guided my steps. Grace enrolled me in school. At first I was terrified. I was so far behind the other students my age. I had missed years of education. I was certain I would fail. But something had changed inside me. That feeling of worthlessness that had defined my childhood had been replaced by something else. A sense of purpose. A belief that God had not saved me for nothing. That there was a reason I was still alive. I studied harder than I had ever studied before. I stayed up late reading by candlelight. I asked questions. I sought help. I pushed myself to the very edge of my abilities. And I did not fail. In fact, I excelled. By the end of my first year back in school, I was at the top of my class. My teachers said I was gifted. They said I had a natural intelligence that years of hardship had not been able to destroy. They said I had a future. A future. For so long, that word had been meaningless to me. The future was something that happened to other people. People with families and resources and opportunities. Not to girls who had been sold by their fathers and rescued from warehouses. But God was rewriting my story. He was taking all the broken pieces of my life and arranging them into something beautiful, something that made sense, something that could help others. I graduated from high school with honors. Grace cried at my graduation ceremony. She told me my mother would have been proud. She told me she was proud. She told me God was proud. I went on to university. I studied social work. I wanted to help children who had experienced what I had experienced. I wanted to be the grace for someone else. I wanted to be the answer to someone else's desperate prayer. During my years at university, I grew even deeper in my faith. I joined a church. I found community. I surrounded myself with people who believed in miracles because they had experienced them. People who had walked through their own valleys and come out on the other side with testimonies of God's faithfulness. I also began to heal, not all at once. Healing does not work that way, but slowly the nightmares became less frequent. The flashbacks became less intense. The wounds on my heart began to scar over. I learned to forgive. This was the hardest part, harder than the studying, harder than the rebuilding, harder than anything I had ever done. I had to forgive my father. For years I had carried hatred for him in my heart, hot burning hatred that consumed me when I let it. He had betrayed me in the worst possible way. He had valued his addiction more than his daughter. He had sold me, his own flesh and blood, the last living piece of my mother. How could I forgive that? But unforgiveness is a chain, and I realized that as long as I held onto my hatred for him, I was still his prisoner. I was still letting him control my life. I was still giving him power over my heart. So I chose to forgive, not because he deserved it. He did not deserve it, not because what he did was okay. It was not okay, but because I deserved to be free. Because God had forgiven me for my own sins and called me to extend that same grace to others. Because forgiveness was the final step in my healing.